Hi, I'm Marguerite with MoveToTacoma.com, and I'm here today with Anders, and we're going to talk about what's going on in the Tacoma real estate market, in particular for investors. And the reason I love to talk to you about this, Anders, you're like a triple threat. First of all, you're a real estate agent. You were an appraiser for a decade, and you were an elected official here in the city of Tacoma before you started your real estate career, and you have that background in zoning and lawmaking that I think is going to be really helpful for investors right now because everything's changing, right?
Correct.
Yeah. So what is it that in 2023 investors investing in Tacoma or maybe selling their investment property in Tacoma need to know about what's happening right now?
Sure. Well, thank you, Marguerite. So besides the change in the overall market, I feel like the most pertinent changes investors need to be aware of in the current market as of now, first quarter 2023, are actually rules. It's less about numbers and it's more about land use and landlord-tenant rules. Those are the biggest changes. So with land use, single-family housing is going away. So that's the biggest thing to know is that there's currently legislation, as we're discussing right now, we'll see what happens with it, looks likely to pass in some form, that would basically allow up to fourplexes in pretty much any residential zone in the state.
And the tipping point for that has been just the tremendous
There's just not
increase in
enough housing.
cost, right?
Not
Like
enough
the
housing.
crisis that we're in as far as people being able to access rental and housing for purchase, right?
Yeah, and we're just completely falling behind. We've been falling behind for years on the need for that supply. What's also kind of exciting about the proposed legislation is it would actually allow up to a sixplex in the current form if 2 units are permanently affordable. So there's an affordability piece. That's the state. With the city, you've probably heard of the Home in Tacoma legislation that's been discussed for the past couple of years. That's relatively similar but different. It's up to a triplex in most neighborhoods. But one of the differences is that it would allow up to 3 to 4 story apartments in major corridors. So think Pacific Avenue, I Street, Pearl, areas like that in our city. And that should be decided around November of this year. So those are both really important components. And on the landlord-tenant side, things are going to get a little bit stricter when it comes to rent increases because Tacoma Pierce County is seeing some of the highest rates of rent increases in the past few years, fueled by the pandemic economy and everything else. And so what's being proposed is effectively what some people call rent control. It would cap the ability of how much you could raise the rent. The current proposal, last I checked, is between 3 to 7% based on the Consumer Price Index set by the Department of Commerce. And there are a few other proposals, a few other stipulations that are attached to it. My understanding is that's made its way through the House of Origin, or at least it made its way through committee. But what form that takes, whether it passes, it's a really big bill. There are a lot of other big bills, and it's a really thorny, complex process.
Yeah, and I think that the bottom line is however you might feel about tenant protections and rent control and all of these things, this is coming. The pressure, the tenants, like they're getting a lot more support, and in some form as the years go on we're going to have more protections for tenants. And what is your advice to investors looking at this market to build that into their business plan? Like what are the things they need to be looking at so that as tenants gain more protections they have a solid investment?
Well, literally the same advice that I would give to someone years ago, which is don't buy overpriced properties. Have a good understanding of the product type and just have a clear strategy, ideally with experts on the ground like property managers, investment specialists, so that you're not buying a lemon. And that hasn't really changed. Numbers are just less forgiving if you make a mistake.
Right. So when you think about the market that we're in 2023, what are the opportunities? What are the property types and the areas where those opportunities are at?
It completely depends. I would say it's less about innate opportunities and more about investor goals, whether it's cash flow, appreciation. I mean, someone who, for example, wants to rent to travel nurses, which are, I think, is starting to become a little bit oversaturated because people are talking about it. That means it's oversaturated. But generally, that would be something like a Stadium District or 6th Avenue, just really rocking single-family home, and then
close to the hospitals.
Then have your furnished finder, right? Versus if you just want straight-up cash flow, a nice South Tacoma fourplex, for example, right? It totally depends on investor goals. Generally speaking, appreciation and cash flow aren't at odds. Generally, if it makes money, it will go up in value. But at the same time, if you have something like an 8% cap rate, you have to question what's wrong with it, right? So everything is case by case, but it starts with your goals and a really sober understanding, not of what will the market be in 6 months, because who the hell can predict that? But what are current market conditions and how to best read them, and if nothing else, just don't buy overpriced properties.
Yeah.
Don't buy properties that don't cash flow at the time of purchase.
That makes a lot of sense. I think now, especially with everything that's happening with the changes in laws and the changes in zoning, investors working with someone who have, an agent that has a lot of proven experience and connections in this world just feels really important. Like, I'm not a person who has transacted a lot of multifamily or investment properties, and this to me is like, wow, there's just so much to know. And I feel like buyers that are working with somebody that have that information, like, they're going to have a big advantage in assessing value and all of that.
It's just important to get the people you're working with too. I mean, I myself live in that world. I am an investor. I have multifamily. I have a condo I rent out to, and whether you're talking about investors or anything else, people just generally want to know that the person they work with doesn't just have knowledge, but also direct experience. And that's why it's been such a pleasure to work with a lot of these people.
That's awesome.
And thank you for them.
Yeah, well, thank you for taking the time to come on and explain what's going on. And I mean, I feel like the big takeaway is everything is changing. Make sure you're informed and don't overpay.
Everything is changing, but at the same time, nothing is changing. Because if you just have a good business plan, you work with a local expert to have a good understanding of current market conditions and just don't overpay, then regardless of the laws, you should be fine.
That's great to know. Thank you, Anders.
Thank you.
Move to Tacoma.com.